No one ever told Elijah that love could feel like drowning. Not the kind of drowning where your lungs scream for air, thrashing in some violent current. No, this was quieter, like slipping into a still lake at midnight, each breath slower than the last, until silence becomes the only thing that feels safe, until even your reflection begins. He stood alone in the hallway, her voice still echoing from the room behind him. Not shouting. She rarely shouted. Her words came like water over stone, smooth, soft, and deadly in time. This time she'd said he didn't care enough, that he never really listened, that if he really loved her, he'd know what she needed with, and as always, Elijah had be. He stared at his hands. Steady, strong, calloused from years of building, things, careers, dreams. But those same hands couldn't seem to hold her love. No, Matt. Was this love? Was it supposed to feel like constantly being wrong? Like walking a narrow ledge where any word could shatter the fragile peace they'd built? In the beginning, she was electric. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made silence feel like applause. He'd never met anyone like her. Brilliant, mysterious, emotionally alive in ways he hadn't realized he'd longed for. He'd fallen fast and hard into that storm. At first, her intensity felt like intimacy, her jealousy like passion, her unpredictability like complexity. He had confused her chaos with depth, mistaking the weight in her voice for truth. But now, standing alone outside their bedroom, Elijah realized something darker. He had stopped asking himself what he wanted. His needs had gone quiet, not out of strength, but survival. She had become his compass. And that, he knew deep down, was the first betrayal. Not hers. His. He had betrayed himself. Carl Jung once wrote that the shadow, our hidden, rejected self, does not disappear by being ignored. It grows, it twists, and when we refuse to face it, we project it onto those closest to us. Elijah had read those words once. They hadn't meant much then. Now they haunted him. What if she wasn't the villain? What if she was just his mirror, reflecting all the parts of himself he'd never dared to confront? He couldn't breathe. He remembered how it started. The first time she withdrew affection, not in anger, but in subtle disappointment. He remembered how hard he'd tried to fix it, to win back her smile. He'd told himself it was love, that this was how love worked, that real connection was supposed to be hard, but love wasn't supposed to erase you. A small voice whispered inside him now. Not hers, not even his mother's, but something older, a boy's voice. One who had learned long ago that being enough meant being needed, that love had to be earned. And in her, Elijah had found the perfect test. He leaned against the wall, heart thudding, not because of her words, but because for the first time in years he was listening to his own. I don't recognize myself anymore, he whispered into the dark. That was the beginning, not of the end, but of something far more dangerous, awakening. Elijah stood in front of the mirror the next morning, brushing his teeth, pretending he was just like everyone else. A man with a morning routine, a man with a purpose, a man who still believed in the life he was living. But his reflection gave him away. There was something haunted in his eyes now, something hollow. Not grief, not rage, a quiet vacancy. He was still there physically, but parts of him had begun to vanish long ago. And it hadn't happened all at once. It began in the smallest ways, the little sacrifices, the compromises he made to keep her happy, then sane, then satisfied, for a day, a moment, an hour, giving up plans with friends, quitting hobbies she thought were childish, redecorating their apartment again and again until nothing in it felt like home anymore. It was like erosion, slow, unremarkable, devastating. He couldn't pinpoint the first time he had lied to himself, but he remembered the last time he told the truth. It was their third anniversary. He'd planned a trip to a cabin in the mountains. She said she hated the cold. He said he understood. He canceled it. He never tried again. Now, brushing his teeth, staring into the dead eyes of the man who remained, Elijah realized he had become an echo. A man made of reactions, reacting to her moods, her silences, her storms. He couldn't remember the last time he acted on desire. His own, anyway. What was it she'd said last night? You always disappear when I need you most. He wanted to scream, wanted to grab the edges of the sink and shout, "I disappeared for you. I gave you every part of me that I didn't know how to protect." But he didn't. He just rinsed his mouth and went downstairs to make her coffee the way she liked it. Oat milk, a dash of cinnamon, one ice cube to cool it. He placed it silently on her desk while she scrolled through her phone. She didn't look up, didn't say thank you. She hadn't in months. Instead, she said, "We should talk later." Elijah froze. Those words always meant something was wrong, and whatever it would be his fault. She looked up then. "It's not working. I just don't feel like you see me anymore." His lips parted, but nothing came. He didn't say the truth. "I see you more than I see myself." He didn't say what he'd rehearsed in his head for weeks. He didn't beg. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded. "Okay." Her eyes narrowed. "That's all you're going to say?" What did she want? Tears? A fight? A declaration of love strong enough to drown out the quiet resentment that had been growing like mold between them? "I'm tired," Elijah said. The words slipped out unplanned, but honest. Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned back to her screen. It should have been the beginning of a conversation, but it was the end of one. He went for a walk that morning. The streets were familiar but felt foreign, as if he were waking up in someone else's dream. He passed the bookstore they used to visit together on Sundays, the little cafe where they once laughed for hours over burnt croissants. He passed their memories like gravestones. And then, for the first time in years, he turned into the alley beside the bookstore, climbed the metal stairs of an old building he used to visit in college, an art studio he hadn't touched since becoming her boyfriend, then her partner, then her ghost. He still had the key. Inside, it was exactly as he left it. Dusty canvases, the smell of turpentine, cracked jars of paint, but it was silent, sacred. He sat on the stool and stared at a blank canvas. He didn't know what he was going to paint, but he was going to try. For the first time in years, he was going to make something that didn't have her in it. Not her preferences, not her critiques, not her voice in his head telling him it was a waste of time. Just him. That evening, when he came home, she wasn't there. A note on the kitchen table said she was staying with her sister for a few days. And something strange happened. He didn't panic. He didn't run after her. He sat in silence and let the house echo with the sound of his own breath. He was still here. Pieces of him had disappeared, but not all of them. And now, for the first time in a long, long time, he wondered who he might become without her. Elijah stood in front of the canvas for hours, unmoving, as if expecting the blank space to speak first. It didn't. Silence had become his companion in recent days. Not the silence between arguments or the silence of avoidance, but something deeper, something gentler. This silence was not absence. It was possibility, and it terrified him. His fingers trembled as he dipped the brush into a jar of cobalt blue. The scent hit him instantly, thick with memory. The first time he held a brush was in high school. His art teacher had noticed him sketching quietly during lunch and dragged him to an after-school class. "Your hands speak louder than your mouth," she said. He hadn't painted in nearly 6 years, not since the start of their relationship. She hadn't told him not to, but she had laughed at it once. That was enough. He made his first stroke on the canvas, a diagonal slash of color across white nothingness. Then another, and another. With each one, something uncurled inside him, something brittle, something old. He wasn't painting a person or a place. He was painting feeling, loss, fear, longing, the ache of silence, the bitterness of loving someone who couldn't love you whole. By the time he stepped back, hours had passed. The sun had fallen behind the city skyline, and the studio glowed orange under weak ceiling lights. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His shoulders ached. But he felt alive. Not healed, but real. He went home that night to an empty apartment. Her things were still there, her jacket on the hook, her perfume on the dresser, but she wasn't. The space felt like it had taken a breath for the first time in years. And yet grief arrived anyway. Not for her, but for the years he'd lost. He stood in the kitchen drinking water, trying to remember what he used to do with his evenings before his life became a full-time negotiation. What did he enjoy? What did he watch? Who was he? He walked into the bedroom and found her old journal on the nightstand. She'd once told him she never kept secrets from him, but here it was, pages filled with words he'd never read. He didn't mean to open it, but he did. The handwriting was her usual looping scrawl, messy but elegant. The entries were dated sporadically, months apart sometimes, and they weren't all about him. Some were about her mother, her job, her anxiety. But then, I think I'm starting to resent him. Not because he's cruel, but because he's kind. Too kind. Like he has no spine. I need someone who pushes back. Someone who makes me feel something. Elijah makes me feel like I'm disappearing. Is it awful to say that? He closed the journal and placed it back exactly where he found it. Sat down on the edge of the bed. He wasn't angry, not really. He was relieved to see the truth of it. The confirmation of what he had always suspected but never dared to believe. That it wasn't all in his head. That his disappearance had been real, but mutual. They'd both watched him vanish, and neither of them had tried to stop it. The next morning he returned to the studio. He painted again. This time it was a storm. Not a literal one, but a feeling. Sharp lines, jagged swirls, violent reds bleeding into hungry blacks. It was beautiful in a way that frightened him. When he was done, he sat in the corner of the studio, with his knees drawn to his chest, staring at what he'd made. His phone buzzed. A message from her. "I'm coming by tomorrow to pick up a few things." Short, cold, final. He typed a reply, then deleted it. What was there to say? The next morning he woke up early and cleaned the apartment. Not for her, but for him. He wanted it to feel like a home again, even if it was just his. When she arrived, there were no tears, no shouting. She looked thinner, as if something had already left her. Maybe it had. Maybe it was him. She packed in silence. He stood near the kitchen counter, unsure of what to do with his hands. At one point, she paused, looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded. "I am too." She looked like she might say more, but didn't. She picked up her bags and left. The door closed behind her with a click that echoed. Elijah stood in the hallway for a long time, and then he laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, but like someone who had just remembered what fresh air felt like. He walked back to the studio that afternoon and began his third painting. This one was light, blinding yellows, open white spaces, soft teal. It didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a beginning. The days after she left were both quiet and thunderous. At first, Elijah moved through the apartment like a guest. Each room felt unfamiliar. The walls breathed differently. The air held a new kind of weight. Not heavy, not light, just hollow. The absence wasn't loud. It was soft, gentle, but it had shape. It curled around corners. It whispered from open closets. It stared back from the other side of the bed. He didn't try to fight it. Instead, he let it teach him. In the morning, he began rituals he hadn't done in years. He opened windows, made coffee just the way he liked it. Dark, bitter, honest. He read poetry aloud to himself. Neruda, Plath, Rilke. Their words didn't comfort him, but they mirrored something he couldn't yet name. One night, he lay in bed tracing invisible lines across the ceiling, wondering how long it would take before he stopped checking his phone for messages that wouldn't come. Her absence wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A void in the shape of a former self. And yet he began to notice something remarkable. He was becoming visible again, to himself. He started painting more regularly. What began as 2 canvases became 5, then 10. Some were abstract, others intimate, fragments of memory, faces blurred with emotion, hands reaching but not touching. He painted what he couldn't say out loud, the loneliness, the slow, aching beauty of solitude, the ache of being missed by no one but yourself. People started to notice. His neighbor Claire, an older woman who lived 2 doors down and kept to herself, stopped him in the hall one afternoon. She wore an old cashmere sweater and smelled faintly of lavender. "I saw your light on all night," she said. "You okay, dear?" He hesitated, unsure of the answer, then simply said, I think I'm beginning to be. She gave a warm smile. Sometimes that's the hardest part. The next day, she left a small plant outside his door. No note, just a quiet gesture, a living thing asking to be kept alive. He placed it on the windowsill of his studio and called it Grace. The gallery where he worked, an aging, tucked-away place run by a man named Martin, began to feel less like a job and more like a mirror. Martin was 50-something and had the patience of stone. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it mattered. "Something's changed in you," he said one afternoon while unpacking a new shipment of pieces. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He stared at a sculpture of two figures, leaning away from each other, their backs barely touching. It was made of stone but looked like breath. "I'm starting to remember who I was," Elijah said softly, "before I made myself small." Martin gave a rare nod of approval. "Then you're doing the real work." Later that week, Elijah stayed late to hang a new exhibit. As he worked, music played low from an old speaker, piano, soft and full of yearning. It was the kind of sound that opened wounds gently. That's when she walked in. Not her, someone else. A woman in a long coat, with dark curls and a face that looked familiar, but not in a way he could place. She wasn't classically beautiful. She was sharp, focused, the kind of beauty you notice slowly, but deeply. She wandered the gallery with the gaze of someone searching for something she wouldn't find. He didn't approach her. He watched from a distance, curious but cautious. After a while, she stood in front of one of the newer paintings, a piece Elijah had done in a rush of fury and sorrow. It was chaotic and tender, violent and soft. It was grief on canvas. She stared at it for a long time. Then she turned and caught him watching. "Is this yours?" she asked. He nodded. "It's unsettling, but honest." He almost smiled. "That's what I was going for." She stepped closer. "There's a moment in it, right here." She pointed to a swirling knot of color near the bottom. "It feels like someone trying not to drown." He looked at the spot. He'd painted that section in tears. "I was," he said quietly. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she met his gaze with something stranger, respect. "I'm Miriam," she said, holding out her hand. "Elijah." A pause stretched between them. It wasn't awkward. It was curious, like two people realizing they'd heard the same song before, but in different languages. She left without saying much more. But he kept thinking about the way she saw his painting, not as a decoration, not as an object, but as a message. The next morning, he returned to the gallery and looked at that painting again. For the first time, he saw what she saw, not just pain, a plea. That night, he began a new canvas, something softer, more hopeful, something that still ached, but with purpose. Not because he was trying to forget, but because he was learning how to live with what remained. Elijah had always believed silence was empty. Now he knew better. Since Miriam's visit, his thoughts moved differently, like footsteps echoing through an abandoned church. Each echo carried a question, a memory, or a curiosity too quiet to hear before. He found himself painting in the mornings, then again at night, sometimes without noticing the hours between. Her name stayed with him, not in the romantic way that names sometimes do, but like a puzzle he couldn't stop trying to solve. Miriam. He said it aloud when no one was around, tasting the syllables like a foreign word he almost remembered from another life. That week she returned. She didn't call ahead. She didn't even say hello when she walked into the gallery. Just gave a small nod and wandered again, like before. This time he joined her. They stood in silence before a canvas she hadn't seen yet, one Elijah had finished just the night before. A single figure painted in shades of ash and amber, standing on a shoreline made of broken glass. "I don't know if this is despair or defiance," she said finally. Elijah crossed his arms. "Neither do I." "But you painted it." "Yes," he said. "Maybe that's why I don't know." She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly. "That makes sense." They sat on the bench at the back of the gallery for the next hour. They didn't talk about art. They didn't even talk about themselves. Instead, they shared small, meaningless details. What coffee they preferred, what cities they wanted to visit, the last dream they remembered. But in those fragments, something built between them. Not connection, not yet. Permission. Permission to not explain everything. Permission to be two strangers who didn't have to perform. When she finally stood to leave, Miriam paused by the door. "I like the way your paintings make me feel uncomfortable," she said. "They don't lie." "Neither do you," he almost said, but didn't. After she left, Elijah didn't paint for 3 days, not out of grief or confusion, but because he needed stillness. Something in her had stirred a layer of him he wasn't ready to touch. Instead, he went walking. He wandered aimlessly through streets and alleyways, past bookstores and jazz bars and cigarette vendors whose smoke seemed to sketch the sky. He sat by the river some nights and watched the reflections of city lights tremble across the water like quiet regrets. On one such night, he saw an older man standing at the edge of the pedestrian bridge, staring down into the water. Elijah slowed his steps. Something about the man's posture, the slowness, the tilt of his shoulders, felt too familiar. He stood beside him. "Beautiful night," Elijah said. The man gave a startled glance but nodded. "It is." They stood there for a moment, saying nothing more. "Do you come here often?" Elijah asked. "No," the man said, "but I used to." That answer held weight, a story he wasn't asking to be told. Elijah simply nodded. After a while, the man turned to leave, and as he walked away, he paused just long enough to say, "Sometimes it's enough to have someone stand next to you." Elijah didn't reply. He watched the man disappear into the dark, then stayed a while longer. That night, he went home and painted again. This one came quickly, a figure sitting on a bridge, surrounded by shadows, but lit from below by a strange, unseen glow. Not a spotlight, not the moon. Hope, subtle, unannounced, but present. When Miriam returned again, this time with a scarf wrapped tight around her neck and her hair pinned back, she found him in the middle of hanging that very painting. She stopped in front of it and didn't speak for a long time. Then, "This one feels like waiting," Elijah smiled. "Waiting for what?" "Not what," she said. "Who?" He turned to her, caught off guard by the weight of her voice. She wasn't talking about the painting. They sat again, this time with less distance between them. He offered her tea, which she accepted, and they drank quietly. The gallery's lights dimmed around them, and the city outside blurred into silhouettes and neon smears. "I've been thinking about the first time I came here," she said suddenly. "I wasn't planning to. I just walked in." "I'm glad you did." "So am I." A silence followed, but it didn't sting. He noticed the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup, the way her eyes avoided his, only to return when he looked away. She was like his paintings, layered, brave, vulnerable in places that demanded reverence. "Do you believe people can start over?" she asked quietly. Elijah studied her. "I think some people already have. They just don't realize it yet." Miriam nodded. "Maybe I'm one of those." "You don't have to know today." She looked at him then. Really looked. That night after she left, Elijah didn't paint. Instead, he wrote. He hadn't done that in years. He opened an old journal, and with a hand that trembled more than expected, he wrote 3 words. "I am becoming." The first time Elijah dreamt of Miriam, it wasn't romantic. It was quiet, more presence than narrative. In the dream, she stood in a long corridor lined with doors. Each one was closed. She faced them calmly, but her hand never reached for a single doorknob. Elijah stood behind her, unable to speak, unable to move. He just watched her watching the doors. When he woke, his heart ached without understanding why. Over the following days, her absence returned like a tide. She hadn't visited the gallery since their conversation on the bench. No calls, no texts, no promise to return. Elijah told himself it didn't matter. She was just a stranger after all. But strangers don't haunt your thoughts like that. He painted more. Shapes that twisted, fractured glass that seemed to cut into each canvas. But no matter what he created, he couldn't find her in any of it. And that absence began to look like its own kind of art. Then late one evening, the gallery door creaked open. Elijah didn't look up at first, assuming it was a passerby drawn in by the lights. It wasn't until he felt a long silence at his back that he turned around. Miriam. She looked different. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed in red. Not from crying, at least, not recently. More like she'd cried and then gone back into the world pretending she hadn't. Elijah set down his brush and walked toward her. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said. "I wasn't sure I should." He waited. She glanced around, then walked straight to one of the newer canvases. A small piece, almost monochrome, where a single thread of gold wove through what looked like burned fabric. "This one," she whispered. "This one feels like pain, learning how to speak." Elijah's chest tightened. "That's exactly what it is," he replied. She nodded, eyes never leaving the painting. "I buried my father this week." The words landed without ceremony, like a blade laid gently on a table. "I'm sorry," Elijah said quietly. Miriam finally looked at him. He was sick for a long time, but the kind of sick that hides behind pride and silence. Elijah said nothing. "My family, they don't talk about real things. They ask how your job is, how the traffic was, but no one ever says, 'I'm scared,' or 'I'm falling apart.'" She walked slowly to the corner of the gallery where the older paintings hung, the darker ones, born of Elijah's own grief. She stood in front of one of the earliest pieces, the one he'd done the week after Sophie died. It was more shadow than shape. "I used to come here before I met you," she said. He blinked. "What?" She turned to him. "Months ago, before I ever spoke to you, I used to stand in the back and just exist. Your work made me feel like someone else understood what silence felt like." He didn't know what to say. The air felt heavy with truths they hadn't prepared for. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked. "I didn't know how, and maybe I didn't want to interrupt what I thought was a sacred place." Elijah shook his head, a soft smile pulling at his lips. "This place is sacred, but it's not sacred because it's quiet. It's sacred because of what people bring here." Miriam stepped closer, not touching, but near enough to feel it. "I'm tired of pretending I'm fine," she said. "Then don't." That night, they didn't talk much more. They just sat, both looking in different directions, breathing in the kind of silence that finally felt shared. And in that quiet, something deep and unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet. Something rarer. Trust. It was that night Elijah realized something terrifying. He was afraid of needing her. Not in the way a drowning man needs air. In the way an exile needs a witness. Someone who sees you and doesn't ask you to become smaller. He didn't sleep well. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice. "I'm tired of pretending I'm fine." The next morning, he went to the cafe down the street, someplace he rarely visited, and sat with a blank sketchbook. He didn't draw. He wrote. Miriam. Just her name. Dozens of times. As if writing it might anchor her in the world more solidly. As if the act itself was a prayer. That evening, when he returned to the gallery, she was already there, sitting on the bench. She didn't turn as he entered. She was staring at the wall where he hadn't hung anything yet, a blank white space. "I like this part," she said. "It feels like potential." Elijah walked to the wall and stood beside her. "Or grief that hasn't figured out what shape it wants to take." Miriam looked up at him. "Maybe they're the same thing." That night she stayed late. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. But when she left, Elijah watched her until she disappeared down the street. And as the door clicked shut behind her, he whispered aloud to the empty room, "I hope she comes back tomorrow." Miriam came back the next day, and the one after that. She didn't always speak much, and neither did Elijah. But their silence no longer felt like avoidance. It was something gentler, an agreement, a soft pact made between two people who understood that healing didn't always come with words. On the third day, she brought a notebook. "I used to write," she said, placing it gently on the wooden table in the corner. "Poetry mostly. Until one day, I just stopped." Elijah didn't ask why. She opened the notebook, ran her hand across the yellowed page, and read aloud without looking at him. "Somewhere between memory and mercy, I left my name on a shore I couldn't swim back from." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "And I keep hearing waves that sound like my father, though they say he never learned to swim." Elijah swallowed hard. The lines nestled into something deep inside him. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "It's broken," she replied. "But I guess sometimes those are the same." He nodded. Everything worth feeling is. They shared coffee that afternoon. She told him about the small, strange rituals her family kept during her father's illness. The way her mother played Sinatra while cooking, how the house smelled like lavender and antiseptic, how the phone never stopped ringing after he died. But no one ever answered. Elijah listened. When she asked about Sophie, he paused for a long time. He hadn't spoken about her in months. She loved thunderstorms, he said eventually. Everyone else would run for shelter, but not her. She'd sit at the window like she was watching a movie. Said it made her feel small in the best way. Miriam smiled but said nothing. He went on, softer now. After she died, I couldn't listen to rain for a long time. It sounded too much like her breathing near the end. Sharp, rhythmic, then nothing. She didn't try to fix it. Didn't say she understood or that time would ease it. She just reached across the table and touched his hand. Once, briefly, like a punctuation mark at the end of a difficult sentence. That was all. And somehow it was enough. That evening, Miriam lingered after the gallery closed. They walked to the edge of the park, where the streetlights glowed like soft moons. A breeze stirred the air, and for once Elijah didn't feel the usual cold that clung to him after sundown. They sat beneath a large sycamore, their shoulders almost touching. "Do you think grief ever ends?" she asked. Elijah tilted his head toward the sky. "I think it changes shape, like water. Sometimes ice, sometimes fog, sometimes a flood." Miriam chuckled. "And sometimes just a puddle you step in without expecting it." "Exactly." She leaned her head against her knees. "I've been scared lately, not of dying, though maybe that too, but more of disappearing, becoming someone no one remembers." "You won't," he said immediately. "How can you be sure?" Elijah was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because I see you, and I'll remember." She turned her head toward him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. And for the first time, Elijah realized what it felt like to be the anchor for someone else's storm. Not because he was healed, but because he was still standing. Later, they walked back to the gallery. He unlocked the door and Miriam stepped inside first. She paused, looking around at the darkened room, the faint outline of canvases still visible in the low light. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. When this place gets too heavy, when your ghosts get loud, you'll call me." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." As she stepped toward the exit, she turned. "And when mine get loud, can I come here?" "You never have to ask." She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Elijah saw something new flicker across her face. Not just sadness or weariness or strength. Hope, faint and fragile, like the first green shoots through winter soil, but real. And that night, when Elijah was finally alone again, he pulled out his sketchbook and drew her, not as she was, but as he saw her now, half shadow, half light. A woman learning to open her own locked doors. The rain came suddenly that afternoon, unexpected, heavy, and warm. Elijah had just finished rearranging the corner installation when he heard it. The soft patter against the gallery's tall windows, like fingers drumming gently on glass. He didn't mind. It reminded him of Sophie again. But the ache was different now, rounder, less jagged. Miriam arrived 10 minutes later, soaked through, curls plastered to her cheeks, laughter bubbling from her like it had been waiting years to escape. "I didn't bring an umbrella," she said breathlessly, stepping inside, dripping on the floor. He handed her a towel without a word. She looked radiant in the kind of way sorrowful people sometimes did when they allowed joy to surprise them. There was something disarming about it, her ability to still be delighted, to laugh, even with everything that pressed on her shoulders like wet wool. Elijah watched her, realizing something. Grief hadn't hardened her. It had hollowed space inside her for other feelings to echo. They sat on the floor beneath one of the larger canvases, Elijah's abstract swirl of storm and dusk. He hadn't named it, hadn't needed to. But Miriam touched the frame lightly. "This feels like remembering," she whispered, "and forgetting at the same time." He nodded. "It was supposed to." They shared the silence after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes silence told the truth better than words. That evening, Miriam asked him something unexpected. "Do you ever miss the chaos?" she said, unwrapping the takeout Elijah had brought in from the Thai place down the street. What chaos! The before, the noise of people, the mess of too many expectations. He thought about it, thought about the studio apartment he and Sophie used to share, where canvases leaned like drunk guests against the walls and jazz records never stopped spinning. He thought about the overlapping voices of gallery openings, the endless conversations about technique in texture and tension, the pretending, the performing. No, he said quietly, I miss the people, but not the noise. Miriam sipped her tea, thoughtful. I used to think I needed the world to see me, like being seen was proof I mattered. But now, she trailed off. But now, he prompted. She looked up, eyes calm. Now I think I just need one person to really see me. Elijah held her gaze longer than he meant to. Then he said, I see you. She didn't look away. I know. Later that night, after Miriam had gone, Elijah did something he hadn't done in a long time. He painted for himself. No commissions, no expectations, no fear of whether it would ever hang on a gallery wall. Just the raw truth of color and motion, the weight of a memory, the tension between longing and release. He painted Miriam, not her face but her presence, the way she made grief feel less like a wound and more like a room with windows cracked open. He used soft colors where he would have once used shadows. He let the light stay. Across town, Miriam sat in her apartment, clutching her old notebook. The rain had stopped. The silence felt wide but not empty. She flipped to a blank page and began to write again. Somewhere in the quiet, I met a man who didn't ask me to be better. Just honest. And that somehow made all the difference. The poem ended there. She didn't need more words. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own skin. And when she closed her eyes that night, she didn't dream of drowning. She dreamed of walking through a museum, hand in hand with someone who saw her, completely, and stayed. Elijah woke up with paint beneath his fingernails and a soft pressure in his chest. Something like hope, though he didn't yet know how to name it. The studio smelled of turpentine, coffee, and rain-dampened wood. His latest canvas leaned against the far wall, still wet but already alive. The strokes were different, looser, more vulnerable. It was the first time in years he hadn't tried to control the brush. He had just let it speak, and somehow it had spoken her name. Miriam, meanwhile, spent her morning at the botanical gardens. She hadn't planned it. Her feet had simply led her there, as if her body knew before her mind did what it needed. She wandered between blooms, quiet colors and quiet people. Children held their mothers' hands. Elderly couples walked slowly, in sync. Everything was soft, tender, alive in a way that didn't shout. A gardener was trimming back a wilting rose bush when she passed. He smiled at her kindly. You can't force it to bloom, he said, almost as if he knew her thoughts. But you can give it room, sunlight, patience. Miriam nodded, feeling something inside her shift, settle. That afternoon, she wrote a single sentence in her journal. I am not a project. I am a season. When she visited Elijah later that day, she found him seated in front of his newest painting, gaze distant. She hesitated in the doorway. He didn't turn around, but he said, Come in. I was hoping you'd come. The room was warm with late afternoon light, and his voice held something she hadn't heard before. Invitation without expectation. She stepped closer, her eyes drifting to the canvas. Her breath caught. It wasn't a portrait, and yet it was. It was her in motion, in memory, in silence. It was grief, yes, but also grace. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Somewhere behind them, a clock ticked. Miriam finally broke the silence. Do you ever feel like you're becoming someone you've been trying to find for years? Elijah looked at her then, the light catching in his eyes. Only recently. They sat beside each other, knees almost touching. Not lovers, not yet, but no longer strangers either. In the quiet space between them, a question bloomed. Not what are we, but rather, what might we be becoming? That evening, they walked to the waterfront together. The sky was bleeding gold, the river smooth as glass. Couples strolled past them, laughter trailing in the air like perfume. I used to be afraid of this, Miriam admitted. the quiet, the not knowing. I thought it meant I was lost. And now? Elijah asked. She took a breath, slow and full. Now I think it means I'm not pretending anymore. The moon was rising by the time they returned to his building. At the threshold, she turned to him. Thank you, she said. For what? For seeing me without asking me to explain. Elijah reached up, almost reflexively, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered a second longer than necessary. I'm not in a hurry, he said softly. We have time, if you want it. Miriam smiled, not with her lips, but with her whole face, her eyes, her shoulders. I want it. And with that, she walked into the night. Elijah watched her until she turned the corner. Then alone again, he whispered to the silence. I think I do too. Miriam hadn't dreamed in weeks, not since the night her father's voice had called to her from the shore of sleep, begging her to come home, a home that no longer existed except in ache. But tonight, her dreams returned, not in words or ghosts, but in color. The sky was bruised indigo, the sea endless. In her hands, an old suitcase she didn't remember packing, filled with fragments of her mother's laughter, the echo of Elijah's paint-stained fingertips, and a single unopened letter addressed in her own handwriting. She woke before opening it, gasping, her heart galloping like it was running from something ancient. Outside, the rain had started again. Elijah, too, couldn't sleep. He sat in front of the half-finished canvas, brushing layers of ochre and blue into the background of a city that looked suspiciously like the one outside his window. But in his painting, the city wasn't crowded or chaotic. It was still, breathing. It held something sacred. Possibility. He thought of Miriam's voice the night before, soft but sure. I want it. He thought of the way her eyes didn't flinch anymore when he looked at her too long. He thought terrifyingly of love. By morning, Miriam found herself on the train out of the city. She didn't call Elijah. She didn't even tell herself where she was going. She only packed a small bag, bought a ticket, and watched the skyline fall away behind her, like a memory she no longer needed to carry. The destination, a coastal town 2 hours north, the place where she had scattered her mother's ashes 3 years ago, where silence used to taste like guilt. Now it tasted like permission. The ocean met her with wind and salt and open arms. Miriam wandered the dunes until her shoes filled with sand and her thoughts softened. She sat on the old driftwood log, their log, and pulled out her journal. I am not broken, I am building. She wrote the sentence over and over until it felt real, until it became real. That night, she stayed in a small inn with sun-faded quilts and old books in every room. She read poetry aloud to herself until her voice turned to a whisper. Then sleep took her gently. This time, there were no dreams, only rest. Elijah stared at his phone 3 times before putting it away. He didn't text her, didn't ask where she was, didn't give in to the part of him that still feared being left. Instead, he went for a walk. He sat in the park where they first talked for longer than 5 minutes. He bought a coffee, gave his spare change to a man on the corner, and stopped to watch a little girl draw chalk hearts on the pavement. He smiled, not because he was happy, but because he finally understood that he didn't have to be happy to be whole. Miriam came back 2 days later, not with answers, but with clarity. Elijah was in his studio when she knocked. He opened the door, saw her windblown hair, her quiet eyes, the small smile she wore like a promise. You went away, he said. I had to remember something, she replied. What? She stepped inside, brushing the rain from her coat. Her gaze found the new canvas, a city with a sky that looked like it might forgive you. That I'm allowed to want things, she said, even after everything. Elijah exhaled, something loosening in his chest. I made tea, he offered. I'd love some. They sat on the floor, knees touching, fingers wrapped around mismatched mugs. Neither of them spoke about the past. Not that day. Instead, they let silence do the work of healing. In time, the silence began to hum, not with absence, but with beginning. Home had always been a complicated word. For Elijah, it meant a place with splintered stairs and silence so heavy it bent your shoulders. For Miriam, it meant rooms haunted by the kind of grief that carved itself into wallpaper and dust. But as autumn curled its fingers around the city, they began building a new definition, something stitched from slowness, attention, and the kind of laughter that still surprised them both when it arrived. Still, healing is never a straight path, and the past has a way of clawing its way forward, especially when you start to feel safe. Elijah's sister Rose called him on a Sunday morning. "Dad's not doing well," she said. "The doctors aren't saying much, but I think you should come." He hadn't spoken to their father in nearly 4 years, not since the night he told him he was never coming back, that he was done being a punching bag for the old man's shame and rage. "I don't think I can," he said, his voice cracking on the edges. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Rose replied. "I'm asking you to choose peace. For yourself." Miriam found Elijah in the studio, unmoving in front of a blank canvas. Not even a pencil mark, just white. When he told her about Rose's call, he expected her to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she sat beside him on the paint-streaked floor, rested her hand over his, and said, "You don't have to go, but if you do, you don't have to go alone." He looked at her startled. "You'd come?" "I'm not here to fix you," she said, "but I will sit beside you while you face it." They arrived in Elijah's hometown just after dusk. The town was small and too quiet, like the silence had soaked into its bones. Elijah hadn't been back since he was 23. The streets still smelled like wood smoke and regret. At the hospital, Rose met them in the lobby. Her hug was longer than expected. "He asked for you," she said softly. "When he's awake." Elijah clenched his fists. "I don't know what I'd even say." "You don't have to say anything," Rose whispered. "Sometimes being seen is enough." The man in the hospital bed barely looked like the father Elijah remembered. Thinner, fragile, his skin pale as parchment. Elijah stood in the doorway, paralyzed by memory, of fists against walls, of doors slammed shut, of being told he was too soft, too weak, too strange. But then his father opened his eyes, and for a moment Elijah didn't see a monster. He saw a man who had failed and was afraid to die without saying he was sorry. "I didn't come for you," Elijah said. "I came for me." His voice was steady, tired but sure. "I carried your anger like it was mine, for years. I thought if I could be harder, quieter, better, you'd love me." The old man didn't respond, only blinked, eyes shining. "I'm done waiting for your love," Elijah said, "but I forgive you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of endings, of release. And somewhere deep inside, Elijah felt something shift. Outside, Miriam waited. When he stepped out of the room, she could tell by the way he exhaled that something had changed. "Did you get what you needed?" she asked. He nodded. "I didn't come for closure," he said. "I came to free myself." She reached for his hand. "And did you?" Elijah looked up at the stars. "I think I did." That night, they stayed in a quiet inn by the lake. No TV, no noise. Just the hush of water and the ache of old things loosening their grip. Miriam lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Elijah beside her, asleep at last. She thought of her own father, of the letter she'd never opened, of the fear that if she did, she might learn something she wasn't ready to carry. But maybe healing wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about choosing to return anyway. In the morning before they drove back, Miriam walked to the lake alone. She took the unopened letter from her coat pocket, the one from her father, sent 3 months before he died. She had carried it like a wound. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. "My dearest Miri, I know I was not a good father. I know I left too much unsaid. But if there is one thing you believe, please let it be this. I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to show it. I hope someday you'll forgive me. Dad." Tears came like tide water, slow, then all at once. She didn't fight them. When she returned to the inn, Elijah didn't ask. He only pulled her close and let her cry. That was the thing about them now. They didn't rescue each other. They simply stood beside the wreckage and waited for the light to come through. Elijah had never thought of grief as an architect, but now as he walked the halls of the old art school, where he'd first fallen in love with color and then lost it, he saw how every heartbreak had built something in him. Strange rooms, crooked staircases, whole wings designed to hold silence. Miriam walked beside him, her fingers lightly grazing the wall, as if searching for ghosts. Maybe she was. It was her idea to come here, not out of nostalgia, but out of need. You said this place made you feel alive once, she'd said. Sometimes we need to stand where we began, to know how far we've come. The studio was just as he remembered. Wide windows, cracked tiles, a smell of dust and turpentine. The light came in at an angle that made everything look like memory. Elijah stood in the center, eyes closed. He could almost hear the hum of his classmates, the clatter of brushes, the sharp critiques that once felt like daggers. He had loved it here, and he had been so afraid. "Do you want to paint?" Miriam asked. He opened his eyes, blinking back the sting. "I'm not sure I remember how." "You don't need to remember," she said gently. "You just need to begin." They found supplies in the back closet, forgotten canvases, rusted paint tubes, brushes stiff with time. Elijah ran his fingers across the tools like they were sacred. He sat before a blank canvas. For a long time he didn't move. And then slowly he dipped the brush into the deep red. His hand shook, but he painted. One stroke, then another. Color returned, not with precision, but with truth. No lines, no forms, just emotion. A raw blooming of everything he hadn't known how to say. Anger, hope, sorrow, peace. Miriam watched, a silent witness to his rebirth. When the canvas was filled, he stepped back. It was messy, unapologetic, wild, but it was his, and something inside him, long locked away, had been freed. He turned to Miriam. "Thank you," he whispered. "You did this," she replied. "I just held the space." That night they drove back to the city. The car was quiet but not empty. Miriam's hand rested on Elijah's knee, a quiet anchor. Outside, the world blurred into twilight, soft and endless. Miriam leaned her head against the window. "Elijah," she said softly, "do you ever wonder what kind of people we'd be if none of it had happened?" He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "You mean, if we'd grown up in safe homes, with love that didn't hurt?" She nodded. "Sometimes I think we'd be lighter, simpler, less afraid." He was silent a moment. "But maybe we wouldn't be us," he said. "Maybe we wouldn't know how to listen the way we do, or love this fiercely." She turned toward him. "I still would have chosen you," she said, his voice caught. "Even if I wasn't broken, especially then." In the weeks that followed, Elijah painted like a man rediscovering his voice. Not for galleries, not for critics, for himself. Each canvas was a conversation with his past, with his pain, with the version of him that had once stopped believing in beauty. Miriam, too, changed. She began writing again, not essays or reports, but poetry, small, aching truths scribbled on napkins, receipts, backs of envelopes. Sometimes she read them aloud. Sometimes she burned them. Both were healing. One evening, Elijah found her curled on the couch, staring at a photo in her lap. Her mother. "She used to sing to me when I was little," Miriam said, her voice quiet. "Before everything got sharp." Elijah sat beside her. She didn't move. "I think I hated her for a long time," she said. "But now, I just miss the version of her I never got to keep." He understood. There are people we grieve who are still alive, because they never became who we needed them to be. Miriam looked at him, eyes wet. "Do you think it's okay to love her and still be angry?" "Yes," he said. "That's the most honest kind of love." In early spring, they began talking about the future, not in vague shapes, but with plans and questions. "Could we ever live somewhere quieter?" Miriam asked one morning. "With space for a garden? Maybe a dog?" Elijah smiled. "You want a dog?" "I want something to take care of, something that won't ever lie to me." He nodded. "Yeah, I think I do too." They were building something, not a perfect life, but an intentional one. And that was enough. One Sunday they returned to the art school. Elijah's painting still hung where he left it. Not on display, just quietly resting in the corner of the studio. Miriam brought her poems. They sat side by side on the wooden floor, reading aloud, one line at a time. Elijah's voice was low. Miriam's shook sometimes. But in that room, echoing with color and truth. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were artists, builders, lovers, people who had walked through fire and come out bearing light. Healing doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like Miriam standing in front of the mirror for 45 minutes before she could choose a shirt that didn't feel like armor. Like Elijah holding the phone in his hand for an hour, thumb hovering over the call button to a father he hadn't spoken to in 6 years. Like quiet breakfasts where no one smiled, but no one ran either. This was the part no one warned them about. That even after choosing to heal, after the breakthrough, the rebuilding, the reawakening, there would be days where the old weight still sat in their chests like stone. One evening, Elijah found Miriam sitting alone on the fire escape, eyes fixed on the city below. "I yelled at a woman in the grocery store today," she said without turning. "She blocked the aisle with her cart and I just snapped." He sat beside her, knees bent to his chest. "I thought I was past this," she whispered. "The rage. You're not broken for feeling it," he said gently. "But I don't want to be like them." He knew what she meant. The people who hurt her. The people who punished love and called it discipline. "You're not," he said. "They used rage to control. You're learning how to let it pass through without doing harm. That's different." Miriam's hands trembled. She pressed them into her thighs to still them. "I'm scared I'll never be soft." Elijah looked at her. "You are," he said. "I see it every day. In the way you touch light switches like they might bruise. In how you whisper to plants. In how you apologize to books when you drop them." She exhaled, the sound half laughter, half pain. "You notice everything," she said. "I never used to," he replied. "But then I met you." Later that night, Miriam cried into Elijah's chest. Not from sadness, but from sheer release. As if her body had finally exhaled something it had been holding for years. He didn't hush her. He didn't ask why. He just held her. And afterward, she looked up at him and said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Yes," he whispered. "When I was 15, I wanted to disappear so badly I started imagining I was a ghost. I would walk the halls of my school thinking, 'No one sees me. I'm already gone.'" Elijah's throat tightened. "I think the only reason I didn't vanish completely is because one teacher, just one, started leaving sticky notes on my desk. Little things. 'You matter. You are light. I see you.'" Miriam closed her eyes. I never told her how much that saved me. Elijah reached for her hand and brought it to his lips. "Then maybe it's time you start writing sticky notes for someone else." The next morning, Miriam went to the bookstore and bought a stack of neon Post-its. She left the first one on the bathroom mirror of a cafe. "You don't have to earn rest. You already deserve it." Another she slipped between pages of a library book. "Who you are is not a mistake. Don't let anyone edit your soul." And another in the changing room of a department store. "Clothes don't define your worth. Neither does the number stitched inside them." Each note was a message to a younger version of herself. Each one was a rebellion against invisibility. And though she never signed them, something in her knew they would find the right eyes. Elijah, inspired, started painting on discarded wood panels. Not with brushes, but with his fingers. Textures, shapes, spirals of motion. He called them his unformed pieces. "I'm not trying to make something beautiful," he said. "Just honest." He left one of them outside a local shelter, another in the stairwell of a hospital, one in the arms of a sleeping man on the subway. Sometimes healing is anonymous. Sometimes it's art that leaves no name. One afternoon, a letter arrived in their mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just folded paper, carefully written. "I found your note in the cafe mirror. I was going to hurt myself that night, but something about your word, they made me pause, just long enough to breathe, just long enough to call my sister. Whoever you are, thank you. You reminded me I exist." Miriam wept when she read it, and then she laughed, not because she was happy, but because the world had tilted slightly toward light, and she had helped. That evening, as dusk painted the sky with bruised lavender, Elijah and Miriam stood on the rooftop of their building, shoulders touching. He looked at her. "What do you think this is?" he asked. "Us." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched a plane cross the sky and whispered, "I think we're both learning how to stay." And in that moment, it was enough. It wasn't the arguments that scared Miriam. It was the silence after. The pause between words, when the air thickened and every second stretched too long. That stillness was familiar. That was the moment in her childhood when things truly unraveled. So when Elijah stood in the kitchen, shoulders tense, jaw locked, and didn't say anything after she told him she needed space, her body reacted as if he had screamed. She backed away. He saw it, the fear in her eyes, and it cut him more deeply than any harsh word ever could. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. Miriam's back was to the wall, hand gripping the countertop like an anchor. "You're angry." "I'm human," Elijah replied, "but not at you. At what this is bringing up. That's different." She nodded, but didn't believe him. Not yet. Her brain had been wired to expect punishment, to see conflict as danger. She couldn't unlearn that overnight. That night, she didn't sleep. Elijah stayed on the couch, even though she hadn't asked him to. He knew her silence was not a rejection. It was survival. At 3 in the morning, she padded into the living room, blanket draped over her shoulders like a shield. "Elijah," he sat up instantly. "I don't know how to fight fair," she said, voice cracking. "Every disagreement feels like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, and if I say the wrong thing, the whole world will collapse." He reached out his hand. "Then let's build a new language," he said, "one where silence doesn't mean abandonment, where anger doesn't mean cruelty." She looked at his hand, then at his face. Then she stepped forward and sat beside him. The next day, they created what they called the stay list, a page in a notebook where they each wrote down what helped them feel safe during conflict. Miriam wrote, "Please tell me when you're upset. I can handle honesty better than silence. Don't walk away even if you need a break. Say you'll come back. Remind me we're on the same team." Elijah wrote, "I need a few moments to breathe before I respond. I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to understand. If I shut down, it's not because I don't care. It's because I care too much." They taped the page to the fridge. It wasn't magic, but it helped. Healing wasn't linear. It zigzagged. It circled back on itself. Some days Elijah woke with fire in his chest and no words to describe it. Old shame, maybe. Some echo from a father who only praised him when he achieved something. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough unless you're doing something?" he asked one evening. Miriam looked up from her book. "All the time," she said. "Sometimes I rest just to prove I can." He laughed, a low, sad sound. "I don't even know what I like when I'm not working." "Then let's find out," she said. They made a game of it. One Saturday, they went to a pottery studio. Elijah's bowl looked like a collapsed mushroom, but he smiled more in that 2-hour class than he had in weeks. Another time, they took a train to the edge of town and watched birds in silence for an entire afternoon. Miriam brought a notebook and sketched everything. Clouds, feathers, Elijah's profile, as he squinted into the light. "I think you're learning how to be," she said on the train ride home. "I'm learning how not to disappear," he replied. Then came the storm, not the weather. The call. Miriam's mother had a stroke. Miriam had not spoken to her in years, not since she told her, in a letter she never sent, "You taught me how to disappear. I'm trying to remember how to exist." But now her mother was in a hospital room 3 hours away, her voice gone, her memory fractured. "What do I do?" Miriam asked Elijah. "What do I owe her?" He didn't answer with advice. He never did. Instead, he asked, "What does your heart say?" Miriam stared out the window. "She won't remember the way she hurt me, but I will." "Then maybe this isn't about her anymore," he said. "Maybe it's about what you need to release." The hospital was quiet, the walls painted in soft, artificial comfort. Miriam stood beside the bed, watching a woman who used to tower over her, now shrink beneath white sheets. Her mother's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they locked. And for the first time in her life, Miriam didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her presence a quiet revolution. When she finally left, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She breathed. It felt like breaking and mending all at once. Back home, she stepped into Elijah's arms and whispered, "She didn't recognize me." He held her tightly. "But I did," she said. "For the first time, I recognized myself." And that night they both slept. Not because everything was okay, but because they knew they were no longer alone in the dark. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. It was morning. A sliver of sunlight cut across the hardwood floor, casting soft gold onto the carpet. In the kitchen, a kettle whistled gently, steam curling upward like a prayer. Miriam stood barefoot, cradling a mug of tea, watching the morning unfold, not with urgency, but reverence. Elijah came in, tousled and half asleep, his t-shirt clinging to the curve of his shoulder. He kissed her cheek without speaking. Their silence no longer meant disconnection. It had become something sacred. The kind of silence that came after the storm. The kind that says, "We made it." Healing had not been a straight line. It was not something they achieved, not something that lived in a checklist. It was a process, a rhythm, 1,000 small choices every day to keep showing up. They no longer sought to be perfect. They aimed to be real. There were still disagreements. Days when Elijah felt the old shadows of inadequacy and Miriam caught herself withdrawing behind invisible walls. But now they named the monsters. Now they lit candles instead of starting fires. Miriam began teaching art therapy at a community center downtown. She didn't call it therapy, too formal, too distant. She called it stories with color. There, women who had forgotten how to breathe painted landscapes with skies that looked like bruises and oceans that looked like escape. Miriam would sit beside them and say, "Your pain is not too much. It's part of your art." One day she painted something herself, a small canvas with a single chair beneath a tree. Elijah saw it and asked, "Is this loneliness?" She smiled. "No," she said. "It's a place to rest." Elijah had started woodworking again. Something about shaping wood with his hands helped quiet the noise in his mind. He sold his first piece, a bench curved and imperfect, to a local cafe. But more importantly, he kept the second one. It sat on their porch, facing the sunset. Sometimes they sat there together, not talking, just breathing. "This," Elijah once said, motioning to the sky, the bench, the shared silence, "feels like life." Miriam rested her head on his shoulder. "No," she whispered, "this is life." One evening in late autumn, they hosted a dinner. Just a few friends, candles flickering, laughter echoing off the walls that had once held so much sorrow. After everyone left, Miriam lingered at the table, tracing her fingers over the wood grain. "Do you remember when we used to fear this?" she asked. "This? Joy," she said. "Love. Belonging." Elijah looked at her. "I still do sometimes," he admitted, "but now I also remember that fear is just a guest." "And we don't build homes for guests," she said, smiling. He reached for her hand. "No," he said, "we build homes for each other." That night before bed, Miriam opened her old journal, the one she hadn't touched in years. She flipped past pages written in a desperate hand, lines that once bled with fear, guilt, longing. On the last page, she wrote something new. "I thought healing was the absence of pain, but it's not. It's the presence of love in the midst of it. It's learning to hold your own heart gently. It's staying when every bone in you wants to run. It's saying, 'I am here, and I am still becoming.'" She closed the journal. Beside her, Elijah turned off the light, and in the dark, with his breath beside hers and the soft rhythm of rain on the window, Miriam whispered into the quiet, "I'm not afraid of staying anymore."